If someone had told me I'd marry a woman whose name I barely knew how to pronounce, I would have laughed at the drama. Boston in winter looked, to Eleanor Hart, like a city suspended between breaths. Snow collected along the eaves of the brownstones in clean, obedient lines. Lamplight burned behind drawn curtains like carefully contained secrets. The sky was a pale, exhausted blue, and the Charles lay under a glaze of ice, still and glassy, like a thought never spoken aloud. On the morning of her wedding, as carriage wheels and polished shoes carried guests toward the church on Beacon Hill, Eleanor stood in the small robing room off the sanctuary and watched her own reflection with the detached curiosity of an actress studying her costume before the curtain rose. The gown was exactly what it ought to be. Its satin shimmered like winter daylight on snow, its lace collar traced a delicate border along her collarbone, modest and precise. Her dark hair had been coiffed into a soft chignon, anchored with pearl pins that caught the light when she turned her head. In the mirror she looked composed, even serene. Her hands, however, told another story. They trembled, betraying a current beneath the surface as though some invisible tide tugged at her wrists, trying to drag her away from shore. Her mother fussed in the background, adjusting the veil, smoothing an invisible crease in the skirt, murmuring reassurances about future happiness and solid respectability. Eleanor listened without listening, like an actress hearing the familiar lines of a play she knew by heart, her mind already drifting toward the next scene. Dr. Richard Hale would be waiting at the altar, a man 10 years her senior, already established, already admired. He had served in the war and returned with a quiet steadiness that spoke of storms weathered and order reclaimed. He was the kind of man who looked right in a medical coat, his tall frame and composed features inspiring confidence. He was also, as everyone reminded her, a very good match. She had never disliked him. That, perhaps, was the trouble. If she had hated him, the wrongness of this day might have roared within her, refusing to be silenced. Instead she felt something gentler and more insidious, a deep, well-mannered unease, like a polite guest seated in the wrong chair too embarrassed to mention the error. Richard was kind. He listened. He spoke to her. Not as one might to a doll, but as to a companion whose opinions had some weight. She had admired him when they first met at a dinner organized by a mutual acquaintance, admired the way his eyes sharpened with interest when discussing a difficult diagnosis, the way his voice softened when he spoke of the children under his care. Admiration, she had been told, was a strong foundation for marriage. The problem was not who he was. The problem was what, and who, she herself was when she stood near him. Eleanor, her mother said, fastening the last button at the nape of her neck, "Do try to smile. It is your wedding day, after all." She obeyed. The smile appeared on her face like light cast upon a painted backdrop, convincing at a distance, fragile when examined closely. Somewhere beyond the closed door, the organ stirred, notes gathering like a rising wind. The minister would be taking his place. The guests would be adjusting gloves and straightening ties. Richard would be standing, hands folded, a respectable figure awaiting his bride. The curtain, she knew, was about to rise. While the bridesmaids filed into the corridor, a sudden image flickered through her mind with such clarity that she nearly reached out to touch it. A hospital corridor bright with artificial light, the scent of antiseptic and starch, and a woman in a nurse's uniform laughing at some quiet remark. The laugh was low, unforced, as clean as the sound of water over stone. The woman's eyes sparkled with a warmth that seemed to reach straight into Eleanor's ribs and settle there. Margaret Byrne. Maggie, to those who knew her well. The memory grasped at Eleanor like a hand from beneath the surface of a lake. For an instant she could not breathe. Someone opened the door. Cold air slipped into the room, smelling faintly of incense and snow. Her father appeared, solemn and proud, offering his arm. Eleanor placed her gloved hand upon it, and together they walked toward the aisle, toward the life she had chosen, or allowed to be chosen for her. The organ swelled, guests turned their heads. Flower petals scattered under her feet like the last bright leaves of autumn. At the far end of that long polished aisle, Richard waited in evening coat and stiff collar, his dark hair slicked neatly back, his eyes full of quiet regard. Light from the tall stained glass windows framed him, giving the impression of a man standing in a doorway between worlds. Eleanor approached, each step sounding like a line delivered on cue. To the watching congregation she resembled a picture of contentment, cheeks faintly flushed, gaze steady, everything exactly as it should be. But inside she felt the faint, inexorable sensation of water rising. Months earlier, before the engagement and the savings of lace and advice, Eleanor had first walked into the hospital where Richard worked. It had been a rain-spattered March afternoon, Boston streets slick and dark, the sky low and heavy. She had stepped from her father's car, clutching a small parcel of books she intended to donate to the children's ward, and looked up at the brick facade of the hospital with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. The war had left shadows in its corridors, she'd heard, the kind of shadows that gather around pain and linger long after the pain itself has passed. Nevertheless, she had wanted to see where Richard spent his days. She had told herself it was only natural for a woman to understand her future husband's world. Inside, the air had been warm and full of purposeful noise, the soft squeak of rubber soles, the murmur of voices, the occasional metallic clink of equipment. Richard walked ahead of her, pointing out various departments with modest pride. Children's ward, surgical wing, private rooms. His stride was steady, his manner efficient yet compassionate, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the busy hallway. They turned a corner, and Eleanor saw her. Maggie stood at the bedside of a small boy, bending to adjust his pillow. Her white uniform seemed almost luminous against the drab blankets, her auburn hair pinned neatly back beneath her cap. She spoke to the child in a low, coaxing tone, her Irish lilt softening the edges of her words. Whatever she said made the boy smile, and he clutched at her wrist as if her presence was a kind of anchor. When she straightened, the overhead lights caught her profile, illuminating the fine line of her jaw, the slight curve of her mouth. For reasons she could not have explained, Eleanor felt her breath catch. Richard greeted Maggie with friendly respect. "Miss Byrne," he said, "this is Miss Eleanor Hart." He turned to Eleanor with a note of pride. "Eleanor, this is one of our finest nurses." Maggie's eyes found hers, clear green under the white brim of her cap. "How do you do, Miss Hart?" she said, extending a hand. The grip was firm, her skin warm. Eleanor heard herself reply with formal courtesy, but her mind was strangely quiet, as though the entire world had narrowed to the space between their hands. Maggie's gaze held curiosity, perhaps a trace of amusement at Eleanor's carefully composed hat and gloves. Yet there was no mockery in it. If anything, there was something like a welcome, an acknowledgement that she existed not merely as Richard's intended, but as a woman in her own right. As they moved on, Eleanor found her attention slipping back over her shoulder. She watched the way Maggie crossed the ward, the surety of her stride, the gentleness of her hands, as she adjusted a glass of water, smoothed a blanket, checked a child's temperature. The tasks themselves were ordinary, but the care with which she performed them made them something else entirely. Light seemed to gather wherever she went, not in the dramatic flare of a spotlight, but in the steady golden way of morning finding its way into a shy room. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the house had fallen quiet. The sounds of the city drifted through the window, a distant train, the occasional automobile, but beneath those familiar noises she heard something new, the memory of a voice, the softness of a laugh, the echo of a pair of green eyes regarding her as though she were a text worth reading and rereading. She turned onto her side, and told herself she was merely unsettled by the suffering she had witnessed at the hospital. Yet the feeling in her chest did not resemble sympathy, nor did it resemble the dutiful affection she cultivated for Richard. It felt instead like the moment when one first steps onto ice, unsure if it will hold, aware of the cold beneath but drawn forward by the strange beauty of it all. The days that followed unfolded according to the script expected of her. Engagement parties, dress fittings, luncheons with her mother's friends, where questions about arrangements and flowers floated like confetti, obscuring the deeper questions she could not voice. She saw Richard on the evenings he could spare from his practice, and he was always courteous, always attentive. He listened when she spoke of books or music, and he took care to ask her opinion on matters of the house they would share. Yet in the background of every conversation, every measured exchange, that other presence hovered like a line forgotten in rehearsal. She found herself asking after the hospital with more than polite curiosity. "And how is Miss Byrne?" she heard herself say one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the public garden, the pond glazed with the last thin ice of late winter. Richard glanced at her, surprised. "Maggie? She is well, I believe. Why do you ask?" Eleanor forced a smile. "She seemed very dedicated," she said, then added quickly, "and quite competent with the children." "She is," Richard replied. "I depend on her a great deal. I expect she will be in charge of the new pediatric ward once it is complete." The idea of Maggie continuing on in that bright, chaotic world filled Eleanor with an odd mix of pride and ache, as though she herself had nothing to do with it, and yet was being left behind by it. She shook the thought away. It was perfectly reasonable, she told herself, to be interested in the staff of her future husband's institution. Perfectly reasonable. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Eleanor found pretexts to return to the hospital. A donation of blankets from a church group needed delivering. A basket of fruit and books for the children. She presented these errands to her family, as charitable activity befitting a future physician's wife. Inside, however, she knew the truth. Each visit was a small rebellion, a step off the prescribed mark. More often than not, she encountered Maggie. Sometimes they spoke only briefly. Other times, they found themselves in the staff lounge, cups of lukewarm coffee between them, the evening's shift a murmur beyond the door. In those moments, the outside world seemed to blur, like scenery sliding past a train window, leaving only the small shared compartment of their conversation. "Do you not find it exhausting?" Eleanor asked once, looking at the dark smudges under Maggie's eyes, "to carry so much of other people's suffering?" Maggie shrugged lightly. "It is a sort of privilege, I suppose," she said. "To be there when a body is fighting to stay, or when a soul is struggling to go. It is not a pleasant theater, but it is very real." Eleanor's mouth curved at the metaphor. "A theater," she repeated. "Do you see yourself as an actress in it?" "Sometimes," Maggie replied, "but more often as stagehand, sweeping up the messes after the drama, making sure the scenery does not fall down upon anyone's head." "And the doctors?" Eleanor asked, trying to sound merely curious. Maggie's eyes glinted with mischief. "They, I suppose, are the leading men," she said. "Some believe the applause is always for them." "Not all," Eleanor protested on instinct. "No," Maggie agreed. "Not all." She tilted her head, considering. "Dr. Hale is not like that." Eleanor felt a small guilty ripple of relief. "No," she agreed softly. "He is not." Maggie's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than politeness required. There was nothing improper in it, and yet Eleanor felt as though a shaft of light had found a crack in a wall she had thought solid. She looked away, pretending interest in the rim of her coffee cup, and tried not to imagine the stage of her life shifting underfoot. After the wedding, the city resumed its steady turning. Snow melted into runnels along the gutters. Bare branches clothed themselves in tentative buds. Eleanor moved into the house on Beacon Hill that Richard had purchased, a tall, dignified structure, with polished floors and high ceilings, its rooms filled with the quiet echo of good furniture and respectable history. The neighbors called. The household staff learned her preferences. Her days became a choreography of small proper occupations, overseeing menus, arranging flowers, writing letters, practicing the piano for the benefit of no one in particular. Richard left each morning in his dark overcoat, returning at dusk with the weight of the hospital upon his shoulders. He greeted her with a kiss, asked after her day, and spoke of his own in measured terms, careful to spare her the more harrowing details. She listened with the attentive expression of a wife performing her role to perfection. From the outside, they made an admirable picture, a tableau that reassured their families and impressed their circle. Inside, Eleanor felt as though she had entered a theater where the set never changed. The same rooms, the same conversations, the same careful gestures. The applause of society came in the form of approving remarks and invitations. She bowed and smiled, praised her husband publicly, and privately wondered when the play would end, when the curtain might at last be lowered, so she could remove the costume and experience, if only for an intermission, the relief of her own unadorned skin. She continued to visit the hospital, now openly as Richard's wife. Nurses greeted her with polite deference. Doctors nodded. Patients' families, seeing the way Richard inclined his head toward her, smiled with gratitude drawn from association. Eleanor accepted their kindness with the practiced grace of someone who understood that she herself had become part of the scenery, a symbolic figure whose presence reassured, like a portrait hanging in a well-kept hallway. Only with Maggie did she feel that the painted backdrop grew thin enough for real air to seep through. One afternoon, early summer light, slanting through the tall windows, Eleanor found Maggie standing in the corridor, a chart in her hand and a frown creasing her brow. The wards hummed with the muted cacophony of illness and recovery. Eleanor approached, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum, and asked if something was wrong. "A child has taken a turn," Maggie replied, keeping her voice low. "We are doing what we can." Her eyes softened as she looked at Eleanor. "You did not have to come on such a day. There is little cheer to be had here." Eleanor hesitated, then said, "I came because I could not bear the quiet of the house. It is like standing in an empty theater, hearing ghosts of applause that was never quite meant for you." Maggie regarded her with a searching expression. "And what applause do you seek, Eleanor Hart?" she asked gently. The sound of her own name from Maggie's lips, unadorned by title or formality, sent a faint shiver through Eleanor. She looked past Maggie, to where the corridor ended in an open door framing a square of intense sunlight. Dust motes turned in the air like suspended snowflakes. "I am no longer certain," she admitted. "I only know that the role I am playing does not perfectly fit. The costume chafes. Roles can be rewritten," Maggie said quietly. "Costumes altered. In Boston." Eleanor let the question hang between them, half bitter, half afraid. Maggie's smile was small, sad, yet stubbornly hopeful. "Even in Boston," she replied. "Seasons change here too." The mention of seasons drew Eleanor's attention inward. She thought of how each period of her life had possessed its own weather, the mild obedient springs of childhood, the bright summers of schooling and possibility, the stiff autumn of engagement with its rich, falling leaves of dreams, and now this peculiar winter of marriage, where everything looked intact but warmth seemed always one room away. She visited more frequently after that. Each visit felt like stepping from winter into a room where a fire burned low but steady. It was never spoken aloud, yet she sensed that Maggie noticed the pattern. The way Eleanor's eyes sought her out even before scanning for Richard. The way her shoulders relaxed when they stood near one another. The way her laughter, so carefully measured in drawing rooms, escaped more readily in the nurse's lounge, unpolished and sincere. One evening, a storm rolled in from the harbor, rattling windows and throwing water against the hospital's brick exterior, like hands demanding entry. Richard was delayed in surgery. Eleanor, who had come intending to accompany him home, found herself stranded in the labyrinth of corridors, while rain drummed a relentless tattoo outside. Maggie suggested they wait in the small break room adjoining the pediatric ward. The room itself was nothing remarkable: a square table, 2 chairs, a chipped kettle, a narrow window made faintly luminous by each flash of lightning. Yet, as Eleanor sat opposite Maggie, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had already gone lukewarm, she felt as though they occupied a stage suspended in time, the storm outside providing a dramatic but distant accompaniment to the intimate drama unfolding within. "You must be accustomed to nights like this," Eleanor said, trying to ease the tightness in her chest. "To storms?" Maggie shook her head, a lock of hair loosening at her temple. "They still unsettle me, if I am honest. But in the hospital there is no time to dwell on such sentiment. There is always someone more frightened who needs reassurance." "Who reassures you?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could call it back. For a moment Maggie did not answer. She looked down at her hands, then up again. Her eyes, usually so steady, seemed to waver, like a reflection disturbed by a stone dropped in water. "I do not often require it," she said at last, a touch too briskly. "One grows used to being the one who holds others afloat." Eleanor thought of drowning then, not as a sudden, violent act, but as a slow descent. She imagined someone in deep water, arms outstretched, holding another struggling body above the surface, while their own head slipped lower, the weight of duty dragging them down. The image pierced her. "I do not like to think of you sinking," she murmured, more to herself than to Maggie. Maggie's lips parted slightly. "Do you think of me often?" she asked, the question as soft as the flicker of lightning beyond the window. Eleanor met her gaze. Whatever else she pretended in her life, whatever lines she delivered with flawless inflection, she found herself unable to lie in that moment. It was as though the storm had stripped away the theater's painted flats, leaving only bare rafters and honest light. "Yes," she said, "more often than is sensible." Silence settled between them, not empty but dense, like snow packing a field. Eleanor heard the rain, the distant shouts from some emergency in the ward, the tick of the clock above the doorway. Maggie's eyes searched her face, as if seeking a script and finding none. "Eleanor," she began, but the door burst open and a young nurse entered, apologies tumbling from her tongue as she relayed urgent news about a patient. Maggie rose at once, the moment shattering like a dropped glass. Duty reclaimed her. She left the room with swift steps, leaving Eleanor alone with the echo of words unsaid. After that night, Eleanor felt as though she walked through two overlapping worlds. In one she was Mrs. Richard Hale, gracious, composed, accepted. She organized dinner parties, where topics of conversation drifted from politics to theater to the latest fashion in wallpaper. She sat beside her husband at long tables and smiled when he squeezed her hand under the cloth. She listened to colleagues praise his skill, to their wives compliment her taste. The house glowed with lamplight, and the murmuring comfort of respectability. In the other world, she was simply Eleanor, and her life was measured not in social engagements, but in glances stolen across hospital corridors, in brief brushes of hands as Maggie passed her a cup, in the sensation of her own heart tightening whenever she heard her name spoken in that particular cadence. She was, she realized, performing two incompatible roles. On one stage, she played the devoted wife. On another, hidden stage, she played a woman waking slowly to a kind of love she had never been taught to name. The effort of sustaining both performances began to exhaust her, as though she were changing costumes in a darkness so complete that she no longer knew which character she was when the curtain rose. Richard noticed the strain, though he could not have guessed its source. One evening, as autumn began its slow, fiery descent upon the city, he found her standing by the sitting-room window, looking out at the reddening leaves. The lamplight cast her in gentle relief, the outline of her figure softened by the drawn drapes. "You are far away," he remarked quietly, coming to stand beside her. She startled, then composed herself. "Only thinking," she said. "Of what?" He regarded her with a physician's concern, as if seeking the subtle signs of a fever invisible to the eye. "Of seasons," she replied after a moment. "How they change whether we are ready or not." He slipped an arm around her waist. "We have had a year of marriage," he said. "One might call that a full turn of the wheel. Has it been what you expected?" The question, kindly meant, struck her like an unexpected chord. She hesitated, then answered as truthfully as she dared. "It has been instructive," she said. "I find I am not altogether the woman I believed myself to be." Richard frowned slightly. In what way? She could have spoken then. She could have confessed the strange duality of her heart, the way another woman's presence had illuminated and unsettled her, the way she felt herself drowning in a sea of obligations, while a small bright boat bobbed in the distance, just out of reach. She might have told him that none of this was his fault, that he had been nothing but decent and kind, and yet his very decency pinned her more firmly to a life that did not fit. Instead she did what she had been trained to do since childhood. She chose the line that would keep the play running. "I did not realize," she said softly, "how much of marriage involves learning to be still." Richard's expression softened. "It is an adjustment," he agreed. "But I hope you know that you are free, within this home, to be yourself." The words, well-meaning, passed through her like light through glass. She smiled, rested her head briefly against his shoulder, and thought of how easily one could drown in still water. It was not a single moment that transformed her vague dissatisfaction into resolve, but a series of small tightening turns, like the winding of a clock. A patient whose child clung to Maggie with such desperate trust that Eleanor felt an almost physical ache of envy. A dinner where a guest made a casually cruel remark about women who do not know their place, and the laughter around the table felt like knives wrapped in linen. A night when she woke from a dream of being on a darkened stage, the auditorium empty, the spotlight burning her eyes, and realized that the only person in the seats was Maggie, watching her with a mixture of sorrow and hope. The decisive twist came during a harsh winter, the cold so intense that the Charles resembled a frozen artery, its usual pulse stilled. An epidemic of influenza ravaged the city. The hospital labored under its weight, beds filled with shivering bodies, corridors echoed with the hollow coughs of the weak. Richard worked late into the nights. Maggie too was stretched to the limit, her cheeks hollowed by fatigue, her eyes ringed with shadow. One night, Eleanor insisted on helping, even in small ways, distributing blankets, reading to children who could not sleep, offering cups of broth to anxious relatives. She moved through the wards, ghost-like in her dark coat, the scent of antiseptic and sickness clinging to her like smoke. Everywhere she saw evidence of battle, fever dulled by medicine, pain eased by steady hands, fear soothed by quiet words. In a small side room, she found Maggie seated beside the bed of a young woman, who lay motionless, her skin pallid, hair plastered to her forehead. A lantern burned on the bedside table, casting a soft glow over the narrow space. Outside, wind howled along the eaves, as if trying to pry them away. Maggie's shoulders were bowed. Her hand lay on the patient's, fingers lax with exhaustion. There was a tremor in her posture Eleanor had never seen before, an air of defeat that shattered the image of the always capable nurse. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped into the room and closed the door quietly behind her. The sound of it latching was surprisingly loud in the hush. "Has she?" Eleanor could not bring herself to complete the question. Maggie shook her head. "Not yet," she murmured. "But she is slipping. Some battles, it seems we cannot win, no matter how we fight." Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something stronger than propriety. She saw that Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That sight, that flicker of vulnerability in the woman she had always imagined as an unshakable pillar, broke something open inside her. She reached out and laid her hand gently on Maggie's shoulder. "You cannot hold back death," she said softly. "You can only make sure no one meets it alone." Maggie gave a small bitter laugh. "There are more kinds of drowning than the kind that fill the lungs with water," she said. "This city is full of people whose lives have gone under long before their bodies do." The words struck Eleanor with painful precision. She realized then that she herself was one of those people, treading water beneath an icy surface of expectation, her cries muffled by the weight of silence. "Come away from her for a moment," she said impulsively. "Let the others watch. You will be no use to anyone if you fall ill yourself." Maggie hesitated, then allowed herself to be led into the deserted storeroom next door. It smelled of soap and clean linen. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with folded sheets and towels. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, its light harsh but honest. As soon as the door closed behind them, Maggie leaned back against the shelves and covered her face with her hands. A convulsive breath escaped her, half sob, half sigh. "I should not," she began. "It is unbecoming. Nurses do not weep over every lost patient." "Nurses are human," Eleanor replied. "And you have been holding the world above water for days. Even the strongest arms tire." She took a step nearer. Without the uniform's professional distance and the ever-present eyes of others, Maggie seemed suddenly smaller, more fragile. Eleanor reached up, and with a caution born of both fear and longing, touched the loose strand of hair at Maggie's temple, tucking it gently behind her ear. Maggie's hands fell away from her face. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them. The faint scent of soap in Maggie's hair, the warmth of her breath, the way her pupils dilated ever so slightly. Eleanor felt as though she was standing on the edge of a great body of water, the line between land and depth uncertain. The safe thing would be to step back. Instead she took a small step forward. "Maggie," she whispered. The name felt like a confession, or a prayer. Maggie's gaze flicked to Eleanor's mouth, then back to her eyes. "Do not," she said hoarsely, though Eleanor could not tell whether the plea was directed at her, at herself, or at some unseen arbiter of morality, watching from the rafters. Eleanor's hand of its own accord slid from Maggie's hair to her cheek. Her thumb brushed the ridge of bone there. She felt Maggie's slight intake of breath against her palm. "I cannot continue to pretend," Eleanor said.
The words tumbled out, hushed but fierce. Not with you, not about you. Maggie closed her eyes, as if the admission were too bright to look at directly. We live in a world that does not make room for certain truths, she said. There are roles and there are punishments for those who refuse them.
I am so tired, Eleanor replied, of mouthing lines that were never written for me. Her voice shook. If I must drown, let it be in something real. Maggie's eyes opened. What Eleanor saw there was not merely desire, though that shimmered at the edges like heat above summer pavement. It was recognition, deep and aching. A mirror finally lifted, slowly, carefully, as though approaching a wild creature that might startle. Maggie raised her hand and placed it over Eleanor's, pressing it more firmly to her cheek. God forgive us, she murmured. Their lips met. It was not an operatic, sweeping kiss as in romantic pictures. There were no violins, no convenient fade to black. It began tentatively, a brush of lips that might almost have been a comfort between friends, and then deepened as though something long confined had finally found a crack and poured through. Eleanor tasted salt, and the bitter tang of tea grown cold, and underneath it all a sweetness that seemed to rearrange the very architecture of her chest. Her other hand came up of its own accord, curling into the fabric of Maggie's uniform as though to anchor herself against some powerful current. For a moment, the drowning ceased. Or rather she realized that what she had feared as drowning was in fact the act of breathing deeply for the first time. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, a voice calling Maggie's name. They broke apart at once, breathless, faces flushed. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs with such force she half expected it to be audible beyond the door. This cannot happen again, Maggie whispered, even as her hands lingered for an instant on Eleanor's arms. Eleanor nodded, though every fiber of her being rebelled. Of course, she said, the lie tasting like ash. The old script, ever ready, slid back into her mouth. Maggie straightened her uniform, smoothed her hair, and left the storeroom with measured steps, the actress stepping through the wings back onto the stage. Eleanor remained where she was, surrounded by the smell of linen and that lingering trace of Maggie's scent. She touched her own mouth, surprised to find that her fingers trembled as though they belonged to someone else. In the days that followed, their interactions were scrupulously proper. In public spaces, they addressed one another with the same formal courtesy as before. If their eyes met, they did so only briefly, like dancers passing in a crowded ballroom, careful not to draw attention. The memory of the kiss burned between them, a shared forbidden light. Eleanor tried to re-anchor herself in the life she had built. She threw herself into the duties of a physician's wife, hosting dinners for Richard's colleagues, organizing charity events for the hospital, visiting parish functions with a smile carefully arranged. She spoke the appropriate lines, laughed at the right moments, complimented other women's dresses, nodded sympathetically at the frustrations of domestic staff shortages. Observers would have seen nothing amiss. If anything, she seemed more energetic, as though a new fire had kindled within her. But beneath that frenetic activity, a fissure opened. The house felt suddenly vast and echoing, its polished surfaces reflecting back an image of herself that no longer matched the person she glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. At night, lying beside Richard in their wide bed, she stared at the ceiling, and felt as though she were on stage under unforgiving lights, terrified that at any moment someone in the audience would stand up and declare that she did not belong there, that she had taken a part meant for someone else. Richard, preoccupied with the demands of the influenza crisis, seemed grateful for her increased involvement in his social sphere. He kissed her hand at dinner, smiled at her across rooms, spoke of plans for a summer holiday once the worst had passed. One evening he mentioned, gently but with unmistakable intent, the subject of children. "It seems only natural," he said, "now that we are settled. Others will expect it, of course, but beyond that, I find myself wishing for a child who might inherit your quiet strength, and perhaps, a little of my stubbornness." The room swam. Eleanor's hands, folded on her lap, clenched tightly enough that her nails bit into her palms. A child. The idea had hovered over her since the wedding, a future act in the play that she had avoided examining too closely. She could picture herself holding an infant, could even imagine feeling a genuine love for such a small helpless creature. But she also saw how a child would tether her more firmly to this life, stitching the costume tighter, making it harder, perhaps impossible to ever remove. "I do not know if I am ready," she said, her voice measured. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "There is no rush," he replied. "I merely wanted to know whether the idea pleased you." She forced a small smile. "It is a serious responsibility," she said. "I would not wish to enter into it lightly." Later, alone in her dressing room, she stared at her reflection and whispered, "What kind of mother would I be, when I scarcely know how to be myself?" Weeks passed in a muted blur, the epidemic waned, spring crept cautiously back into the city, ice retreating, crocuses pushing tentative green tips through leftover snow. One bright afternoon, as Eleanor walked home from a visit to her parents, she found her steps turning, almost of their own accord, toward the river. The Charles gleamed under an earnest sun, its surface broken here and there by small chunks of ice drifting lazily, like memories refusing to melt. She stood on the footbridge, gloved hands resting on the cold iron railing, and stared at the water. She thought of drowning again, of how one might choose to let go, to sink, rather than thrash endlessly in a life that no longer fit. But another image superimposed itself. Maggie's face in that storeroom, the way her eyes had softened when Eleanor declared herself tired of pretending. Was there perhaps another way, not to drown, but to climb out of the water altogether, to step onto a shore unseen by most? A familiar voice spoke behind her. "I wondered if the river would claim you before I could reach you." She turned, heart jarring. Maggie stood a few feet away, coat buttoned against the lingering chill, hair loose of its cap, and softer around her face. The sight of her in civilian clothes, no crisp white, no badge of profession, was disorienting, as though the theater's leading actress had stepped into the audience. "I was only thinking," Eleanor said. "You do a great deal of that," Maggie replied. There was no reproach in her tone, only observation. She joined Eleanor at the railing, and together they looked at the water. "It is treacherous this time of year," she added. "Looks calm enough, but the current is swift under the surface." "Like people," Eleanor said. "Like marriages." Maggie exhaled, a small cloud in the cool air. "How is he?" she asked. She seldom spoke Richard's name in Eleanor's presence now. It hovered unspoken, a polite ghost. "He is well," Eleanor answered. "Kind, industrious, everything a physician and husband ought to be." "And you?" Maggie's gaze shifted to her, the real question settling between them. Eleanor hesitated. The river moved beneath them, carrying stray fragments of ice toward the sea. "I feel as if I have been performing the same scene for so long that I no longer recall what came before it, nor what might come after. There is only this endless repetition of lines and gestures." "You could walk off the stage," Maggie said quietly. "It is permitted, you know, even if the audience disapproves." "At what cost?" Eleanor turned to face her fully now. "My family would be scandalized. Richard's reputation might suffer through no fault of his own. I would lose my place, my name, whatever security I possess." "And what do you have now?" Maggie asked, her voice no louder than the whisper of water against the bank, "that you truly claim as your own?" The question threaded itself into Eleanor's chest, lodging there like a hook. She felt suddenly, acutely visible. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I have you," she wanted to say, but the words caught. Maggie reached out. Her gloved hand closed around Eleanor's, a simple contact that nevertheless sent a shock through Eleanor's entire body. They stood like that, hands joined, for several long seconds. Passers-by might have seen only two women sharing a quiet display of friendship by the river. They could not have known that beneath the surface of that gesture swirled currents strong enough to remake lives. "I cannot ask you to ruin yourself," Maggie said at last. "I know too well what the world does to women who step outside their assigned roles, and I cannot continue to exist only in the shadows." Eleanor replied. "I am weary of seeing the light and never stepping fully into it." Maggie's fingers tightened around hers. "If you chose another path," she said hesitantly, "if you left the stage they have built for you, you would not have to walk it alone." There it was, the offer as fragile and fierce as a crocus bud pushing up through snow. Eleanor felt something shift inside her,
the way ice cracks with a sharp report when the thaw reaches its heart. Say it plainly, she murmured. For once let us speak without metaphor. Maggie flushed, but her gaze did not waver. If you leave him, she said, voice trembling only slightly. If you leave that life, I would take you in, not as a guest, not as a duty, but as, she faltered. Eleanor reached up and touched her cheek, mirroring that night in the storeroom, but under the open sky. As what? Eleanor asked. As the woman I love, Maggie said. The words came out almost inaudibly, yet they rang in Eleanor's ears like church bells. Eleanor closed her eyes. Sunlight pressed against her lids, making the world behind them glow red and gold. The sound of the river faded. She felt as if she stood in a theater, where the audience had fallen away. The stage lights dimmed, leaving only a pool of natural light between her and the other actor. I love you, she replied. The simplicity of it astonished her. For so long, love had been wrapped in obligation, in propriety and mutual benefit. This love felt entirely different, dangerous and pure, like clear water. When she opened her eyes, she found tears on Maggie's lashes. A small incredulous smile curved her mouth. Then we are both mad, Maggie said. Undoubtedly, Eleanor agreed. They parted soon after, conscious of the city around them. Yet something essential had been said, and could not be unsaid. That night, back in the Beacon Hill house, as she walked from room to room, turning off lamps, Eleanor saw each pool of light as a question. In the study, where Richard's books lined the shelves, she paused. He sat at his desk, reviewing papers. He looked up, and smiled. You are reflective this evening, he observed. Yes, she said. I suppose I am. He set his pen aside. Is something troubling you? Everything, she thought, and nothing that you have done. I am only thinking about the future, she replied. He smiled. I can think of no future in which I am not grateful to have you by my side, he said. The tenderness of that statement nearly undid her. It would have been easier, she realized, if he had been cruel, or indifferent. Then she might cast herself as heroine against an obvious villain. Instead she stood opposite a good man, whose only crime was that he was not the one her soul reached for in the dark. That night, sleep eluded her. She rose, wrapped a robe about herself, and went downstairs. The house was quiet, its polished surfaces reflecting back the faint glow of the street lamps outside. She entered the sitting room, and stood by the window looking out at the city. Boston at night was a constellation of small private lights, each window a stage where some unseen play unfolded. In some, no doubt, a husband and wife slept peacefully, their roles aligned with their hearts. In others, someone lay awake, staring at the ceiling just as she had been, rehearsing conversations that might never take place. She realized that every life, in some sense, was a performance. But there was a difference between acting out of choice, choosing, say, kindness over cruelty, silence over gossip, and acting under compulsion, forced to recite lines that violated one's own truth. The difference, she thought, was authenticity, and authenticity, it seemed, demanded sacrifice. Over the following days, a plan took shape in her mind, not fully formed, but gathering weight like snow accumulating on a branch. She felt the branch bending, heard the faint creak. At some point she knew it would break. Her task was to choose the manner of its breaking. She began with a letter, sitting at her small writing desk in the corner of her bedroom. She addressed it not to Maggie or to her family, but to herself. She wrote down, in painstaking ink, the truth she had long avoided, that she did not love Richard as a wife was expected to love, that her affection for him, though real, did not ignite her heart, that she loved another, and that this love, though forbidden, had awakened in her a sense of self she could not bear to relinquish. She did not sign the letter. She folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her dressing gown. 2 days later, she asked Richard to come home early. He arrived while there was still light in the sky, his expression curious and slightly concerned. They sat in the sitting room, the afternoon sun angling through the window and painting long rectangles of gold on the floor. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly that the knuckles blanched. You alarmed me, Richard said gently. Is someone ill? No, she replied. At least, not in the usual sense. He nodded slowly. Very well, tell me what troubles you. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times, but now that it had arrived she found her mouth dry, her tongue heavy. She looked at him, at the familiar lines of his face, the honest concern in his eyes, and asked herself whether she could do this to him. Then she thought of Maggie by the river, offering to walk beside her into the unknown. She thought of her own reflection so often viewed now with a sense of estrangement. She thought of drowning. I have been untruthful, she said quietly. Richard's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. In what way? He asked. In the most fundamental way, she replied. In accepting a role I cannot in good conscience continue to play. He watched her, his gaze steady. You will have to be clearer, Eleanor. I am not sure I understand. I did not marry you out of passion, she said. I married you out of admiration and a desire to do what was expected of me. At the time I thought it sufficient. I told myself that love could be politely cultivated, like a garden laid out according to fashion. But gardens cannot be forced to bloom with flowers that will not take root in that soil. He exhaled slowly, as though bracing himself. Are you telling me you no longer love me? She swallowed. I am telling you that I never loved you in the way you deserve, she said. And that to continue as we are would be to live a lie both for you and for me. His jaw tightened. Is there someone else? He asked, then shook his head as if ashamed of the commonness of the question. Forgive me, that is perhaps not the point. But it is, she replied softly. There is someone else. I did not seek it. I did not expect it. But it is nonetheless true. He stared at her, eyes searching her face for some clue, some answer that would make this comprehensible within the framework of his world. Who is he? He asked at last. Eleanor felt a peculiar clarity settle over her. She could lie, she could invent a man, some imagined stranger, and fit this confession into the familiar pattern of marital disappointment. Or she could speak the truth, and in doing so step fully into the light she had long skirted. She is a nurse at the hospital, she said. Margaret Byrne, Maggie. Richard blinked. The name she saw, registered. He had spoken it himself 100 times praising her competence. But the pronoun slipped into his understanding like a fish into still water, sending ripples outward. I see, he said slowly. He looked away toward the window, as though needing to focus on something fixed. The silence stretched. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped, roughened by something she could not quite identify. Hurt, disbelief, a sense of betrayal, not just personal, but existential. I confess I do not know how to think about this. Nor did I, Eleanor said. For a long time, I thought I was defective, that something in me was missing or warped, and then I realized that perhaps I was merely miscast. That is a gracious way of saying that I am the wrong man, he said, a bleak half smile touching his mouth. It is not about you being wrong, she replied, or even a man. It is about me being myself. At last, he stood and walked across the room to the mantel, bracing his hands on it. His back was to her. In the reflection of the mirror above she could see his face pale, drawn, eyes too bright. After a moment he spoke. Do you love her? He asked. Yes, she said simply. And she loves you. She has said so, Eleanor replied. He gave a soft incredulous laugh. I have spent my life studying the body, he said. The heart, the lungs, the blood that flows. I thought I understood its workings. Yet here is a kind of arrangement I had not properly contemplated. I am not sure whether to feel enlightened or ridiculous. I had no desire to humiliate you, Eleanor said. I know this is unspeakable perhaps in many circles, but I could not continue in silence. He turned then and looked at her fully. What is it you are asking of me? He said. Do you wish to carry on like this, with he faltered over the word, with her in the shadows and our marriage as a cover? She shook her head. No, I cannot ask that. I wish to leave. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something surprisingly soft in his gaze, undercutting the stiffness. You realize what that means, he said. The whispers, the loss of standing, perhaps even estrangement from your family. I do, she said. And yet you are willing to endure it. If the alternative is to drown in my own deceit, she replied, then yes. A long moment passed. Finally he exhaled. You are braver than I, he said. I do not mean in leaving. I mean in admitting this to yourself. I suspect many would go to their graves having never done so. She felt tears prick her eyes. I am so sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. Do not apologize for your nature, he said. It is I who must reorient my eyes. I would rather lose you to truth than keep you in a lie. I only wish, his voice broke. He steadied it. I only wish I had healed bodies and not hearts. They seem infinitely more complex. He crossed the room and sat beside her again. For a moment they sat in silence, two actors acknowledging that the play they had been in together had reached its last act. What shall we tell others? He asked, finally. The truth will be twisted enough by whispers, she said. Let us at least begin with a gentler version. That our temperaments did not suit. That we parted by mutual accord. He nodded. Very well. He studied her face as though memorizing it. Will you be safe with her? She smiled through her tears. As safe as one can be in a world that insists certain loves do not exist, she said. But I will be alive. He gave a small nod, as though performing an internal calculation and arriving at acceptance. Then I release you, he said quietly. Not without sorrow, but without malice. In that moment, Eleanor felt something like a curtain falling. It was not the triumphant drop at the end of a successful performance, where applause erupts and actors bow. It was quieter, more solemn, the drawing of a veil over a chapter that had contained genuine care, however misaligned. The practicalities of leaving unfolded more prosaically. Arrangements to be made, possessions to be divided, family members to be. There were tears, accusations, bewilderment. She did not share the particular truth of her love with Maggie with her parents. She knew that for them, such an admission would not be an opening into understanding, but a wall behind which they would retreat in horror. Instead she bore their disappointment, their talk of duty and sacrifice, their insistence that a wife might grow to love her husband more properly with time. Time, she thought, had already been given. It was no longer a remedy, but a chain. At last the day came when she stood once more on a threshold, a suitcase bundled. The house on Beacon Hill loomed behind her, its windows blank in the grey light, like eyes closed against a scene it preferred not to witness. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Somewhere nearby, a sparrow sang, a small tentative sound that nevertheless pierced the chill. Richard stood beside the carriage that would take her away. He held himself with his usual composure, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. I will write, he said. If you wish, you may, she replied. Though if it pains you, do not feel obliged. He smiled faintly. Obligation seems a poor foundation for continued acquaintance, does it not? She almost laughed, a brittle sound. We have built enough upon it, she said. Let whatever comes next stand on something else. He squeezed her hand briefly, then released it. Go, he said, before I lose my nerve and insist you stay. She stepped into the carriage. As it pulled away, she looked back once. Richard stood on the pavement, hands in his coat pockets, watching. He raised one hand in a small sad salute. She returned it, then faced forward. The carriage rattled over cobblestones, past shops and townhouses, past the familiar landmarks of a life she was leaving behind. With each turn of the wheels, she felt something loosen within her, like stitches being gently undone. There was fear, of course there was, coiled in her stomach. But there was also a strange exhilarating sense of lightness, as though she had been carrying a heavy costume for so long that she had forgotten how it felt to move without its weight. Her destination was a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city. The building was unremarkable, brick, narrow stairwell, a faint smell of coal in the hall. She climbed the steps, suitcase bumping against her leg, heart beating hard. At the end of the corridor, a door stood half open. Light spilled out, warm and golden. Maggie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. For an instant they simply stared at each other, the enormity of what had been done hovering between them. "You came," Maggie said, voice choked. "I did," Eleanor replied. "I hope you have not made up the bed for a ghost." Maggie let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She stepped forward, took the suitcase from Eleanor's hand and set it aside. Then she cupped Eleanor's face in both hands and kissed her, not with the urgency of stolen moments, but with a deep, steady tenderness, like someone lighting a lamp they intend to keep burning. Inside, the apartment was small but filled with signs of a life lived intentionally. Books stacked on a low shelf, plants crowded on the windowsill, a kettle humming on the stove, 2 cups set out, as if the table had been expecting her. The window looked out over rooftops and a sliver of sky. The afternoon light streamed in, unimpeded by heavy curtains or the need to impress. As Eleanor stepped into that space, she felt as though she were entering not merely a room, but a new season. The air was different, not perfumed with duty, but alive with possibility. The role she stepped into now had no script provided by society, no pre-written lines. She would have to improvise, to learn each gesture as she went. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Later, after the kettle had been poured and the first flood of conversation and confession had ebbed, they sat together on the narrow settee. Outside, the light softened into evening. Maggie's hand rested over Eleanor's heart, as if to reassure herself it still beat. "Do you regret it?" Maggie asked, her eyes searching. Eleanor thought of the house on Beacon Hill, of her parents' stricken faces, of the security she had relinquished. She thought of Richard's quiet dignity, of his final salute. Then she thought of the weight that had lifted when she stepped into this room, of the way her own laughter sounded here, less constrained, more her own. "I regret that honesty hurts others," she said slowly. "But I do not regret stepping into it." Maggie exhaled, relief softening her features. "We will be talked about," she warned. "Even if they do not know the full truth, they will speculate. 2 women living together, one a divorced physician's wife. Tongues will cluck." "Let them," Eleanor said. "They will forget us when some fresher scandal arises. In the meantime, we will go on living." She looked toward the window. The sky had deepened to indigo, the first stars emerging like small distant assurances. She realized that for the first time since childhood, she did not feel as though she were drowning in someone else's story. She felt herself afloat in her own. The years that followed were not without difficulty. There were bills to pay, health to maintain, the everyday friction of 2 distinct personalities sharing close quarters. There were moments of fear, when an unexpected knock at the door, or a particular expression on a neighbor's face, sparked anxiety. Societal walls did not crumble overnight, merely because she had refused to abide by them. Yet there was also a steady accumulation of small joys. Mornings shared over coffee, evenings reading by lamplight, walks along the river where the water no longer seemed a threat, but a reminder of movement and change. Each season etched itself into their shared life. In spring they planted herbs in pots on the windowsill, delighting in the stubborn greenness that pushed up through the soil. In summer, they escaped to the shore when they could, wading into the cold Atlantic with shrieks and laughter, then lying side by side on the sand, warm and salt-streaked, watching gulls wheel overhead. In autumn, they collected leaves in the public garden, pressing the brightest ones between pages of books. In winter, they sat close by a small stove, the city muffled by snow outside, their own breath forming soft clouds in the chilly air before the fire grew. Sometimes, when Eleanor's mind drifted backward, she remembered the stage upon which she had once performed. She thought of late suppers on Beacon Hill, of her mother's firm expectations, of the polished silver, and the careful arranging of flowers. She felt sorrow then, not so much for the loss of those trappings as for the girl she had been within them, trying so hard to please, mistaking compliance for virtue. But the sorrow no longer threatened to pull her under. It was more like a shadow on the wall, evidence of something that had been but no longer governed her steps. One evening, years after she had left, a letter arrived bearing Richard's familiar precise hand. She opened it with a mix of trepidation and nostalgia. Inside, he wrote of his continued work at the hospital, of advances in medicine, of the changing city. He mentioned a new wife, a woman whose interests aligned more easily with his own. He expressed hope that Eleanor was well, that she had found the life that suited her better. There was no recrimination, no veiled plea for her return, only a kind of gentle closure. Eleanor read the letter aloud to Maggie. When she finished, Maggie reached over and squeezed her hand. "He has found his own season," Maggie said. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "As have we." They sat by the window then, watching the city lights flicker on, one by one. The world beyond remained complex, imperfect, often unkind. But within their small apartment, a steady light burned, a light not of performance, but of presence. Eleanor rested her head on Maggie's shoulder and closed her eyes. She did not imagine an audience. She did not rehearse lines. She simply breathed, deeply and without fear, in the knowledge that the role she played now was one of her own choosing. The drowning had ceased. The curtain, such as it was, had been drawn back, not to reveal a grand stage, but a modest room, where two women sat in the quiet certainty of shared truth. In that simplicity, there was a radiance no chandelier could rival.